to be motivated by things that are external versus really getting in touch with what you are all about, to be doing to be in my stress response all the time and constantly be running and losing contact with my values, what's important to me, how my body feels. I think I was out of contact with all of that. So the me making that phone call was definitely, I'm totally stressed. I'm aware that I need to take time off. I'm aware I'm not in a good space, but I've got a client screaming at me, and I know that I'm the only person that can fix this.
Hello, welcome to Exploring Emotional Overdraft with me, Andy Brown, and today I'm delighted to welcome Hannah Holden. Hello, Hannah.
Hello, thank you for having me.
I'm just going to fess up a little bit. It has been slightly stressful. Hannah and I have both had to cancel this meeting previously, and just as we were about to start, we had a power cut today. I had a power cut. So it's been, if I had an emotional overdraft running at the moment, I've been topping it up very rapidly in the last 20 minutes. So, but Hannah's been brilliant already and just gone, it's just a power cut. It's just, let's move on. Let's get going. So it's good. And the reason I'm excited to talk to Hannah is because not only is she going to share her personal story of burnout with us, which is wrong to say I'm excited about it, but that we're going to hear. It's great to hear other people's stories and know that this is not uncommon and that other people are dealing with it as well. So that's its value. That's what that excites me. But also Hannah is the fantastic host of a podcast called Burnout Isn't Necessary. And I had to read that. I glanced down to read my notes because I keep calling it stress isn't necessary, but stress is necessary. Burnout isn't necessary. It's a fabulous pod and I'd encourage you to give it a listen. So what we get, which we don't always get here today, is a level of expertise around, well, what can you do about it? What can you do about burnout? Or when you feel you might be heading towards burnout, what can you do? And that's going to be a complete treat. I'm going to mercilessly pick Hannah's brains on that. But before we kick off, you have a very interesting background as well. Could you just share your background and how you got to where you are today?
Yeah, sure. So my background is in IT projects and programs, and then in consulting, all in the IT space, but never hands-on techie. And the relevant bit of the journey for this conversation is that I experienced burnout as a consultant about 10 years ago. I loved my job. It was in an international consulting company. I was getting to work on international clients. I was getting to travel. I was getting to work with colleagues around the world. And I was doing all of this because I was a subject matter expert, and there were a few of us in the company that had that level of subject matter expertise. But unfortunately, one of the downsides of being one of the few people who has this particular subject matter expertise was that when the other two people left the company, my workload was just unmanageable. And yeah, I'm more than happy to go into any of the details of, I think I had some signs, though I'd experienced chronic stress in previous roles. And so I think I probably entered this job with a level of emotional overdraft already. But this particular role, went fast. And and then when the others left, it just became too much. And I'm more than happy to go into like all of the gory details of what burnout looks like, but that's where it started.
Great. And just so people know what it is that you do now.
So now I specialize in burnout prevention. I'm really passionate about, I talk about navigating stress rather than managing stress. Because I think that when I say navigating, I think that we all can leverage the power of stress, the energy that it can give us. And that can be a very positive thing, but obviously it's not sustainable. So it's also about mitigating the downsides and trying to reduce the long-term impact, but also acknowledging and accepting that it can be positive and we can make the most of it. So yeah. And you've already mentioned the podcast, Burnout Isn't Necessary. I think if we talk about, is burnout necessary, I could get very passionate about that. It's not.
And this is why when I first came across Hannah's work, when I was researching the book, actually, was where it resonated for me, because the reason I call it an emotional overdraft is that an overdraft is, so for anyone who's new to this, an emotional overdraft is when you subsidize the success of your business at your own mental or physical cost, in short. And the price you pay for that is your resilience, as I see it. So the idea of an overdraft is that you have a short-term borrowing facility. You could dip into it. It's expensive. It's not a sustainable way of borrowing, but it can be incredibly useful and very valuable, and can dig you out of a hole or present or help you sort of exploit all sorts of opportunities. And that's probably where Hannah's coming from, I think, when you talk about stress, that its ability to enable you to do things you wouldn't otherwise do. So it really resonated. And I think we come to this from quite a similar place. So without wanting to be all Jeremy Kyle about this, could you talk us about how you got to the point of burnout? Because, in fact, before you do that, could you tell us what you mean by burnout? Because I think that's really important to understand. These words are used fairly interchangeably: overwhelm, burnout, stress. Could you tell us what you mean by burnout, and then what happened to you?
Yeah, sure. I think a lot of people use the term burnout to just mean that they're tired. So I feel really burnt out today. The fact that they include the word today in it would suggest it's not burnout, because burnout isn't something that happens for a day. um, as far as my terminology would go. So yes, burnout is physical, emotional, mental, spiritual exhaustion, depletion, with aspects of it. I think it's akin to depression. So my experience included depression. I wouldn't say that I didn't seek external help. Perhaps that was because it was 10 years ago and I didn't really understand what was going on. So that may have been about the culture at the time, but it may also have been about my opinion on where I was. I don't think I understood that I was in burnout when I was there. Yeah, so your other question, so that's what I mean by burnout. The other question was, so what did that look like? Yeah, so as I said before, a couple of my colleagues left. My workload became unmanageable. And I remember a conversation with my new line manager. He'd offered to support me if I needed him. And I was being like, I don't need help. If I have to ask for help, it means that I can't cope. And then everybody knows that I'm not able to do my job. So there was some imposter syndrome as well. They'll all realize that I'm not fit for my job if I say that I need help. I had this assumption that nobody would ask me to do anything above and beyond what was reasonable. And I believed that what was being asked of me was reasonable. And therefore I was the problem. I've heard somebody else talk about how people react to stress in different ways. And it's like the fight and flight, but in a slightly different way. So fight being where you externalize things and blame, and flight being where you internalize things and self-criticize. And that was definitely me. I saw the problem and I assumed I was the root cause of that problem. And therefore I didn't want to be verbally seeking help and so on. Anyway, I did call him on one Friday afternoon, because at about 4 o'clock or 5 o'clock in the afternoon, I got a call from a client. So I was in consulting. And they were shouting, and they wanted the deliverable completed, and we'd already communicated to them that it was going to land at some point next week, not on the Friday, but we thought that we'd already gone through that conversation earlier in the week, but suddenly it became urgent. And I called my boss saying I knew that I needed to take the weekend off, and that I had made no plans. I wanted to take downtime and look after myself. So I phoned him saying, this is the scenario. And his response was something like, what do you want me to do about it? And there are two ways that you could interpret that. So I've told some friends this, and they're like, wow, your boss is amazing. He's really empowering you. He's letting you tell him. And he's saying that he'll do whatever you want him to do, but you need to tell him. For somebody who's in burnout and they are that stressed out, it's very difficult for them to problem solve. It's very difficult for them to advocate for themselves and say that actually the right thing is for you to phone the client and tell them that Hannah needs to take the weekend off. So for somebody who's so close to burnout, they're not going to do that. They're not going to self-advocate. They're going to think they're the problem, and they're going to think that they're also the solution. And so that was me. And I just thought, well, he's asking me to solve the problem I phoned him for help with. He's of no use to me. Like, this phone call is of no use whatsoever. I guess I just have to work the weekend. So I did. And I think that may have been the straw that broke the camel's back. I don't quite remember exactly the timing of everything. For me, the low point of burnout was my husband plays golf. He was out at golf for the day. So it was going to be, 5 hours till I saw him again. I was trying to do something for myself. I used to love painting. I used to love watercolors. I tried to sort of reconnect with that part of myself. And I just stared at a blank sheet of paper, and there was nothing left to give. And I looked inside myself for the person that I would recognize, for the person that I knew I was, for like the 10-year-old child that used to exist and used to love all this stuff. Like, where's she gone? And I found nothing. I was just so depleted. I didn't recognize myself. And all I knew how to do was work. And the reason that what I haven't mentioned is that the reason that I overinvested in work is because all of my self-worth was coming from work. So I'd got myself into a situation where I felt useless and worthless, except when I was getting accolades from work or recognition from work. Like, this client loves Hannah. Oh, you've done another amazing job. Oh, we've got a renewal with that client. That's what I just wanted, that positive feedback. And so, yeah, I had over-indexed on work and drained myself to a point where I had nothing left to give, emotionally, mentally. I mean, mentally, I guess I was still running, but emotionally and spiritually, I was just gone. I was depleted. I didn't recognize myself. And I just collapsed on the kitchen floor and cried for many hours. And whilst that was my low point, it was also my turning point, because it gave me time to reflect on the mess I'd managed to get myself into, what it was that led me there, which I believe is following. So I was thinking, how did I end up here? I did all the things. I've got all the things. I'm happily married. I've got a beautiful house. I've got a great job. Where did it go wrong? Why am I so miserable? Like, I've got all the things, and I've done all the right things that society tells us we need to do. How can it be this? How can I feel this empty? How can it feel so terrible? And then realizing, well, that's following the things I thought I should have, I thought I needed, has got me into this mess. So how am I going to get myself out of it? Well, what do I really want? Like, what does success look like for me? What does happiness look like for me? If I think about a future that makes me want to get off this kitchen floor and stop crying and feeling sorry for myself, what does that future look like? And I realized that the thing for me at the time that I most wanted was to be a mum. And so that realization allowed me to make decisions. So what I mean by that is I put that front and center for everything from that point forward. So I don't think I quit my job immediately, but I think after a few weeks I did. So it affected big decisions, but more importantly, it affected the tiny decisions. It affected how I treated myself in terms of my exercise regime. So before, it would have been, I'm going to go to the gym and beat myself up at the gym as well. I'm going to work out really hard, and I'm going to get rid of all this stress, and I'm going to leave there full of, endorphins, and I'm going to feel great. And that was my vibe beforehand. But afterwards, it was far more gentle. This was what really brought me into my yoga practice. And also decisions like, what am I going to have for breakfast? Like, I don't want to put rubbish in my body if what I want is to be pregnant. I don't want, I need to be. And so I shifted the way that I was treating myself, because I had a really clear picture of where I wanted to be. And so it's interesting, because I've since learned that this using an identity and focusing on an identity is actually a technique that coaches sometimes use when they're working with people. And identity-based change is so much easier than saying, now I'm going to eat healthily. Oh, I didn't, I ate rubbish for breakfast. I'm going to beat myself up about that. But identity-based change becomes really easy because it's something that motivates you. It's something you want to move towards. But it's just interesting that that's how I got myself out of that pickle that I had found myself in. And so it was a slow road to recovery, I think. I quit that job and I took time off. And when I did return to work, it was with great care. So I was only contracting. I wasn't prepared to work full time. I'd pick and choose which types of client engagements I was prepared to work on. So it took time for me to feel confident. I think something that we don't talk about much, but people who have experienced burnout, I think almost all of them are really scared about going back there. I know I certainly was. Um, that was the worst moment of my life. It was the worst day of my life. And I don't want that for anyone else, which is why I now have a podcast called Burnout Isn't Necessary, because I really believe that you can be successful at work. You can be present with your family. You don't need to pay the cost of your health. Yeah. So it's now my inspiration, right? It's my inspiration for what I do. Horrible though it was, it's now what inspires me to do what I do.
Thank you for sharing that. It's really appreciated. And I think a lot of people will be relating to that directly or indirectly. So thank you. It's really healthy for us to hear that.
Yeah, I agree.
Whilst I was listening, it seemed to me that you felt it was up to you when you're in your high pressure job to sort everything. And it was for lots of reasons. Let's not try and sort of psychoanalyze that, but you felt it was important that you were in control and that you were seen as high achieving and you had all the necessary badges like the house and the holidays and all the rest of it. And yet it was also you that worked out when you were crying on the floor that what you needed to do, your instinct told you what you needed to do to get out of it. So I'm really interested in that because I think on one level I was listening to your story thinking, so how can we stop it being us thinking we have to do everything, we have to achieve everything, and we're the ones that have to do it, to the point where you heard what someone said and interpreted as you should work that weekend rather than something else. And yet at the same time, you worked out, or you somehow got to the point where you said, I need to change this and I need to do something differently. How do you think they feel like very similar behaviors and yet they had very different outcomes? Where do you think that happened, or how do you think that happened?
So they do seem similar because they're both me being an independent, bloody-minded, etc. But the difference, I think, is to be motivated by things that are external versus really getting in touch with what you are all about. To be doing to be in my stress response all the time and constantly be running and losing contact with my values, what's important to me, how my body feels. I think I was out of contact with all of that. So the me making that phone call was definitely, I'm totally stressed. I'm aware that I need to take time off. I'm aware I'm not in a good space, but I've got a client screaming at me and I know that I'm the only person that can fix this. Well, actually, there was one other person that could fix this, but she also needed the weekend off. And she was more junior than me. And I felt that the responsible thing to do would be for me to take the hit, not for me to just pass it off onto her, even because she was probably not far behind
So
me.
many things, these things you've told us are exactly the sorts of things we talk about in Emotional Overdraft because they are exactly the behaviors of leaders, founders, entrepreneurs when they feel they should take some of these things on. And it's amazing. You're a sort of textbook case, really.
Yeah. So yeah, I don't really talk about her very much because it's really about sharing my story. But yeah, there was somebody who could have done it. But I wasn't prepared to pass the buck. For her sake, not because I felt like I could do a better job. Either of us could have done it. So I think that when I was there on the floor, I was fully in the present, in my moment. I had fully processed a lot of emotion. And I got to a place of actually feeling very relaxed. I think I don't know if you've experienced this or any of your listeners have experienced this, but when you cry for so long that you feel a sense of release and a sense of exhaustion, and it's almost relaxation. And so I'd got myself to a point where I had kind of emptied myself of all of the stuff I'd been carrying and felt more connected to myself, and therefore in a place where I could begin to tap into my values, what really mattered for me. I don't think I was really tapping into how my body felt, but that was kind of too late by that point. I was in such a mess. What I mean is that the body shows us so many signs and symptoms that we're stressed and stress is affecting us. It shows us there and then in the moment. And it also shows us as stress accumulates. But I had got to such a place where I'd already ignored years of warning signs. I didn't realize I was ignoring them. I didn't put I wasn't able to put the picture together. I had all of the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle, but they were in a right mess, and I didn't see their connectedness. So it wasn't intentional ignorance, but yeah, I had got to a place where like the body warning signs were irrelevant. I'd already fallen off the cliff.
And even when you do spot those things, sometimes I was talking to someone else on a podcast before, and he said he went to a doctor, and the doctor said, you've got very serious anxiety. And he said, I haven't. I'm doing really well. Everything's going great. We're growing. I've got this great job in New York. What are you talking about? But his body was shutting down. He was blacking out. He couldn't, he had all sorts of physical challenges. So the body absolutely knew, but his mind couldn't accept it. Even when a professional told him, diagnosed him, he couldn't accept it. So I can see how you can get to that point. You can get to the point where for years you can take this on and be in what I would call an emotional overdraft, but that's very expensive emotional borrowing. And it somewhere you're paying the price for that. It feels to me like you solved it. And I think a lot of people listening will be in various stages of stress or anxiety or heading towards a burnout, and will go, I know this, I can kind of see this, but how do I do something different? How do I change it? I have people who say to me, I've read the first 2 chapters. Someone today said, I've read the first 2 chapters of your book and I love it. I said, great, but I don't have time to read the rest of the book. And now I'm feeling bad that I can't make the time, because you think, well, so people are in that situation. What is it that they could do to give themselves, not get to the point where they spend 5 hours exhausting themselves, crying on the floor, which is the extreme version? What could they do to just step away and find that perspective to allow themselves to self-analyze better the way you did? What could they do?
So I think that getting to know your values is helpful, which I'm sure if you Googled it, there'd be plenty of places that you could find a way of doing it. But I also think my journey from that low point to health would have been far faster if I was working with somebody else. If somebody was working with me, if somebody had seen, so I was working with a client recently, and their HR lead could see in them that they were heading to burnout and involved me to intervene. Initially, the client was saying, well, do you think Hannah works out of hours? Could we do it in the evenings? And not seeing this as something that they should make time for in their day. Like, they couldn't see how they would be able to make time for. And I think that we need to recognize that when you're really stressed, it's like being up like this with the problem, because there are certain areas of the brain that get shut down, and those are the ones that can see the big picture, and problem solve and be creative and come up with creative solutions, which is why there was me going, there is no creative solution. The guy says, what do you think, Hannah? I don't want to pass the buck to my colleague. And so the only solution is for me to do this. there was no creative thinking there. But so you need to shift your mind into a different state in order to be able to get that big picture, and really I think that if you're super stressed, if you are in the state that I was in that particular day, that is not a good place to be if you want to try and understand what your values are. You're going to be so disconnected from the truth of who you are and what you're all about. It's not going to work. So if you are in that state, then I think there are options. You could work to release all of that and de-stress. And obviously, so I've got 2 yoga teacher trainings. I'm going to be suggesting things like yoga nidra, which is where you lie down and there's a guided meditation. It's been rebranded as non-sleep deep rest, or NSDR, more recently by Andrew Huberman, who thinks that scientists prefer acronyms, but they're one and the same, basically. So things like that. So if you wanted to take this into your own hands, then, like a bath or whatever it is that helps you really unwind, to then be able to tap into what does a positive future you look like, or looking at your values. But I also believe that working with somebody, finding a coach, somebody who mentor, someone, maybe it's even just a friend, who can support you and who sees things, it will make it so much easier and so much faster, and they'll see things that you're not necessarily seeing. So with the client, it was very, very quickly, we did the values exercise together, and she could quickly see where she was making decisions that were misaligned for her. And then also for her in this particular situation, which will be maybe unique to her, she was doing everything. And she had a team underneath her, and she didn't embody the difference between responsibility and accountability. And so while she knew it kind of theoretically, and she had been told, your problem is that you don't know the difference between responsibility and accountability. Her problem wasn't that she didn't know. She didn't know what the embodied version of that looked like. And because I come from the same industry as her in consulting, I was able to give her like live examples of how I did things when I was acting as an accountable owner. And that was a big game changer for her, because suddenly she could see what the lived version of accountability versus responsibility would look like in her job. And she started picking up new behaviors, but now that she could see it, she could act it. And that made a big difference to her. Suddenly, she didn't have to work long hours. And in fact, she could get all of her work done in less than her working hours, and then do some of the other things that she really wanted to be doing at work. And that happened all in the space of just a few sessions, because somebody on the outside can often see something that you can't necessarily see when you're in your own head bubble with all of the stress and the chaotic thoughts.
Thank you. Just want to touch on values for a second, because I think some people switch off when they hear that. They hear, oh yeah, okay, we've got to get our values, and there's a mission or a purpose. There are words that are just bandied around quite loosely. This is why I love Brené Brown's book, The Atlas of the Heart, where she has 84 or 87 words for feelings. The better we can define things, the more accurately we can use words, the more we can communicate this stuff. And I wonder, when you're talking about values, if we'd said to people, understand what you value, it might work more for some people.
Yeah. And so for me, when I was in burnout and I was recovering, values were not something I was looking at. It's not something that I did. I just thought, how am I going to get out of this mess? What's a future vision for me that makes me want to get off this floor? And so I said that I was depressed. The experience that I had, I don't think I had depression over a long period of time, but my experience there was a form of depression. I don't think that it required diagnosis because it wasn't long term, but I think that it was akin to depression. And trigger warning here. So I know of others who have ended their life as a consequence of burnout. And it's I didn't have thoughts of doing that, but I can understand how if you were in that state for a long period of time, if I couldn't see a way, so I knew I needed to find a way out of there. I knew I couldn't exist in that state for a long period of time. And so there was in exhaustion there on the floor. I was motivated to find something that was going to make me want to get off that floor. It needed to be big enough. It needed to be inspirational enough. It needed to provide motivation. Because if it wasn't big enough, then I would remain on the floor. Yeah. And I didn't know how long I could remain in that state for. So that's, yeah. So for me, it was about finding a future that was that inspired me enough to get off the floor.
And that's what I mean by valuable. What was valuable to you once what you described as big enough or important enough to get you off the floor, and that was becoming a mother. And I think if people go, I'll look up values on Google and I'll work out how to do my values and I'll create values, and I value, curiosity, and I can tell you my values, but what's valuable is almost easier to access in the moment. And I don't think you have to be in that dark place. So I've got, I do mention in the book this particular example, but it's a client of mine said, I'd love to take a month off in the summer to spend with my kids whilst they're still young, before they go off to university and I never see them again. I'd love to take a month off in the summer and spend a month with my kids. That's something extremely valuable. He's found a way to explain that and verbalize it. So I said, well, let's design your business around that. It might mean that you have slightly lower profits because you might need to employ some other people. It might mean that we grow in a different way. It might mean we do things differently. But if that's the thing that's most valuable, is that you don't want to get to 16 or 17 or 18 and when they go off and, pretty much they become adults and you just won't get time with them and regret not having done this. And it took us nearly a year, but we redesigned his business so that he could take a month off.
Yeah. So he was getting intentional about it. So it wasn't just, oh, I wish I could do that. Oh, that would be a really nice thing, but it's never going to happen. But instead, it's about, I want this thing. How can I make that happen? And getting really intentional about it. And I was really intentional about keeping that thought of who am I trying to become? I'm trying to become a mum. What would that mum be doing now? What would she be having for breakfast? What would she have for lunch? How would she exercise? How am I going to become her? How am I going to become the healthy mother that I want to be? Well, it's not by eating rubbish and beating myself up every time I put my trainers on.
I just think this is so valuable. People listening to this, this is why I do the podcast. I think, I just know people listening to this will be finding value in it. Brilliant. And the other thing, I think, just to say, because you said values and get help, and this is not me blowing my own trumpet, but in that moment with the client when he said we were whiteboarding all the sort of things about their business, we were doing a planning session for the following year, and he said, I'd love to take August off. It took someone outside to say, well, then let's do it. Let's make that a thing. So he would have just gone, oh, I'd love to take August off. But he's probably been saying that for 5 years since he had kids. So that value, and I talk about a personal board. I love the idea of a personal board where you have a handful of people who can act as like the board of your company, the company of Hannah, the company of Andy. And that's your cheerleader and your mentor, your coach, your physical coach. Those sorts of people, your peer, someone who sort of works in a similar job to you, that you can tap into and who are slightly removed and can be a bit more dispassionate. Not necessarily professionals. They're not necessarily people you have to pay for their advice, but they are people who, and they might not even know you're on your board actually, but they're people who intend for you to do well, who want the best for you, who you have permission to tap into for help, advice, connectivity, whatever those things are. I love the idea. So the idea of getting help doesn't just mean a coach for me. It means, like you said, it could just be a friend. No, there's nothing just about a friend. So it could be a friend and those sorts of things. Fabulous and so important. And yet we get into that mindset where we are too busy. I recall my coach years ago, and I was feeling guilty because I set up my own business and I disconnected lots of friends who I hadn't spoken to for a long, long time, And I said, I feel really bad and they must think I'm an arse. Not the word I used. They must think I'm a terrible person for not contacting them. And he said, well, okay, let's do an exercise. Write down 14 people. I said, there's hundreds of people I haven't spoken to for ages. He said, write down 14. I don't know why he picked the number 14. I will ask him. So write them down. And he said, between now and the next time we talk in a month's time, contact all of those people. Just contact them in by email, by phone, by letter, whatever means you need. And I contacted all those people, and all of them, without fail, said, God, Andy, I've been such an arse. I meant to get in touch with you. Life got in the way. I've done, I haven't, versions of what I was saying to myself, which is incredible because I had decided it was me and I was a bad human. And they were all sitting there thinking with their group of friends, I'm a terrible person. I haven't got time. I've got kids. I've got family. I've got career. And then we had lockdown and whatever. And yet they were thinking the same thing. And it was a complete revelation to me that it wasn't my fault. It wasn't me being a bad human. And that they were just as excited to hear from me and they were just as connected as we had been. Some of those people I hadn't spoken to for 5 years. And we just carried on the conversation as if we'd stopped it yesterday. It's an amazing thing, this connectivity, isn't it? I think it's for people who feel they don't have time to look after themselves. They don't have time to do all the things they need to do. They're listening to this going, that's all well and good, but I don't have time. The power of connecting back into your network is astonishing because they will give you some perspective.
Yeah. And so I don't have time. What are you not delegating? What are you doing that doesn't need to be done? Where are your priorities? Which does bring us back to values again, because and we can talk about that in terms of what is valuable to you. So when are you spending time with your family? I spoke to somebody who also he went, I think this is a story that's very similar for many of us, that we go into something with an intention. So he came from a background without any privilege. Like he described wearing shoes that had holes in, but the whole neighborhood did, all the friends did, everybody around him did. And so it wasn't a big deal, but there wasn't much money, right? And he wanted to provide better for his family. So when he entered the world of work, I think he married fairly young, but I don't remember. But anyway, so he was married, children, career was the most important thing because that was how they were going to get money and they were going to be able to live better. But the reason behind him working was to support the family. So family was actually the thing that was important to him, but how that manifested in his behavior was to try and get as much money as possible to be able to support the family. But then he got to a place where actually he had achieved enough success in his career that the family were comfortable, but he was just perpetuating the behavior because that's what he was used to doing. And at no point did he give himself a checkpoint and say, family is the thing that's valuable to me. Am I still prioritizing my family? By this point, the money wasn't the priority, but spending time was the priority. And that he missed that for a few years. Was lucky enough that the wife was still there by the time he had his dawning realization, and that the kids were still young enough that he could still spend time with them.
Which is not always the case.
Which is not always the case, yeah. And so I think it's interesting as well to know that sometimes you're not completely out of alignment with what's valuable, but you might be just perpetuating an action that was the right thing at one point. But we need to check in with ourselves because we sometimes veer off the path without realizing.
There's a quote that I'll get wrong and I'll credit it properly in the notes. But they said, we sacrifice our happiness to achieve the things that we believe will bring us happiness. And I thought that was it's not an exact quote, but I thought the principle of that thought is so right. We're kind of giving away this stuff that we really value, sacrificing time with our family, being a part of our community, contributing to society, looking after our physical health, whatever it might be, to do something which we believe in the long run is going to give us the opportunity to do the things that we've just sacrificed in order to do it. It's absolute madness, but we do it. It's, oh gosh, I wish I will learn who said that, but that's what came into my head when you were talking. That we and if we check back in with what we value, our values, what's valuable, that at least gives us a chance to course correct a little bit and go, "Oh, okay, hold on. Me making piles of money." We talk about this with kids, don't we? A lot when you take them to Disney, or you have the big blowout holiday where you think you're going to give them this amazing experience. And the thing the kids remember, my kids are both in their 30s now, but when we went to a Roman palace in Sussex, it's just mosaics and things. The thing they remember was finding some little coins, Roman coins, that we hid in the car park by the car for them to sort of discover. And they were 5 or 6 or something. That's what they remember. And we just took the time and were present, and we thought, wouldn't that be funny? And 25 years later, that's the thing they can recall, not going to Florida to go to whatever it was, that not particularly. So I think reminding ourselves of our values and being present, like you said, you cried yourself out to the point where you were totally present. That's astonishingly powerful place to be, I think, isn't it? To be present.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was thinking about presence when you were talking about trading the happiness of today for the happiness of the future. It's because we're not present. We're not going, we are working through it and not noticing, or we're dwelling on the things that we don't have or the things that aren't going right, and we're not necessarily pausing and saying, look at the things that are going right. Because they don't need our attention, right? They're not screaming for attention like the things that are going wrong. But it just takes a moment's pause to notice. Yeah.
I think we could talk on and on about this, and I hope we get the chance to talk again. I think we've created something here that's small and perfect and really valuable. It's not perfect. Of course, it's not perfect, but it's really valuable in its own self-contained way. The idea of values and getting help, and the different things the values mean and the different thing that getting help means. I think we should stop the conversation there. I think it's just, people can take that away and go and hold it and explore it and do something with it. But I really hope we can talk again. So what we always do at the end of this is I ask people to share one simple change that people can use to reduce their emotional overdraft. And I say simple, not easy. So, it's these things are often simple, but not necessarily easy to do. And I think you've got one you wanted to share with us.
Yeah. So for me, I think there are many places that people can start, like becoming more aware of what their stress response looks like, for example, becoming more aware of the symptoms of chronic stress so they can spot it in themselves. But in terms of things that I think that are the great place to start are these little body hacks that you can use. So I mentioned earlier that I've got 2 yoga teaching qualifications. The body and the mind are so interconnected. I talk a lot about the science of stress, and that it's not just in our mind, that what we think shows up in the rest of our body. I could go on for ages about this as well, about the biochemistry that's going on in the body. But yeah, suffice to say that it's not just in our heads, it's stress is experienced throughout our body. And we can reverse it, not by thinking, but like the best way to think about this is, whenever have you been told by somebody, or you've told someone, just calm down? Like, how many times does that work? Yeah, no, that doesn't work. You can't turn down the stress dial using the mind, but you can turn it down using the body. And there are so many little hacks that can work in an instant that you can use with the body to reduce your stress response. And so the one that I'll share with you, I think, is the one that works the fastest. It's called the physiological sigh. And we kind of fake a sigh, and to do that we need to take in a very deep breath. So the best way to do that is to take 2 sips in to really fill up the lungs. So the first sip is to pretty much a comfortable full breath. And then the second one is really fill up the lungs. And then a really long, slow exhale. So as if you're breathing out through a straw. So we can try this together. We'll just try it once. I think that doing it maybe 3 times is suffice, and that you can do that in under a minute. So we'll just do it once together. But if you're going to try this when you're in the midst of stress, then I'd recommend trying it 3 times over. So we sip in through the nose till we're more or less full, and then fully inflate the lungs with the second sip, and then lips as if you're blowing out through a straw. So it's a long, slow exhale. And I think you'll notice just by doing it once, I noticed that it's really powerful. It's powerful for a few different reasons. The lungs will, the alveoli in the lungs will collapse on themselves and get sticky and gummed up. And by really overinflating the lungs, we get more capacity back. And extending the exhale triggers some sensors that are monitoring the pressure around the heart, and they will pick up that there's an increased pressure and send a signal to reduce your heart rate. So it's just this. So yeah, you didn't think you could consciously reduce your heart rate? You can, just by slowing that exhale breath. Amazing. There you go.
Brilliant. And that is a simple change. That is an easy, simple change you can do. Absolutely. And try it and let us know. Let us know. So, Hannah, I'm sure people have been inspired listening to you. If they want to get in touch, what should they do?
So I'm on LinkedIn. Hopefully I should be easily findable. I can give you my contact details for the show notes if you like.
I'll put them all in the bottom, yeah.
Perfect. Yeah. So that's the easiest place to contact me, I think. Yeah. I've got a website, it's hannahholden.co.uk. I've got other ways of contacting me. And obviously the podcast, Burnout Isn't Necessary. It's on Apple and Spotify.
Burnout Isn't Necessary is great. It's a really good and useful and powerful thing. And if you're sitting here thinking, Andy, I found the time to listen to your blinking podcast, you're asking me to find time to listen to another one.
Go for a longer walk.
Of this, the more of this you do, the more you listen to, I'm not saying just me, but people talking about the subject, the more you listen to people like Hannah, the more you will get to control this. You'll get some semblance of perspective. And hopefully this has been incredibly helpful to you today. So Hannah, I thought it'd be great, and it was better than I expected. So thank you for sharing that. Sorry, Benny. Thank you for being so generous with your story as well. It's been lovely talking to you.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. It's been fun. Thank you.
Oh, what can I say? I've never stopped a conversation early because it was going so well. But I've just taken 15 minutes to reflect on that conversation before I recorded this, because there was so much applied value we got from Hannah there. Incredibly generous and brave, I thought, to share that. But those lovely 2 ideas to take the time. It doesn't matter how busy you are. It doesn't matter how under pressure you're feeling. And I talk about this in the book when I came home late, and again after work, very late at night, and I'd missed the kids going to bed, and I crawled in with one of my kids and just cuddled them and cried because I knew what I was missing. And that was when I started changing some things, and I changed way back in the day. I started working from home and did something different. And what I valued was spending time with my kids, seeing them. I didn't want to see them all the time necessarily, and that's definitely not healthy for them or for me, but I wanted to see them growing up. I wanted to be part of their lives. And I realized what I valued. And Hannah picked that out so beautifully. And the other point was around the what I call the board, or getting help. And the first thought was, well, you could get a coach or get counseling or whatever. But help can come from all sorts of places. It can, talking about it, just reconnecting with people, And when it just feels like you're too busy, I've got a piece of paper here on my desk saying, phone this person. It's been there for 2 or 3 days, and it's someone who I know needs a phone call from me and who I love. And I will do that tonight. And hopefully he'll appreciate that, but I will too. And it's been preying on my mind because I've been so busy. It's been a busy few days, but it's always busy. So I'll make that time. And I know that it'll recharge me a bit. I know it'll make me feel better, and hopefully it'll do him some good as well. So take that away. In those moments when it just feels like it's all crowding in, what is it that you really value? What are your values? And how can you speak to someone? How can you get some help? Who could you lean on for some advice? Simple. Hard, but simple. I hope you have a great rest of your day or rest of your week, and may your emotional overdraft always be tiny. Thank you.